You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. On this episode of Icons, Thomas is joined by Patrick Burke, currently the Executive Director of the DC Police Foundation and formerly the 42nd United States Marshal for the District of Columbia and serving 27 years with the Metropolitan Police Department. Patrick has served his country and his community for decades, and when asked about the profession, he went on to say, "Policing. The way I look at it, it's a profession where you're actually paid to help people. When you think about that, isn't that a wonderful thing?" And now for Icons, featuring Patrick Burke, Family, Community, and Safety.
Thank you very much, Pat, for being here with us today. I really am looking forward to this conversation and sharing more about your work with our listeners.
Great. Thanks so much, and I'm glad to be here with you.
Good. So I wanted to start with a cliffhanger. You have something in common with Frederick Douglass, true or false?
That is true.
Not many people can say that. And before we reveal the answer and get into some of today's topics, let's just talk a little bit about where you're from and your family, a little bit of the personal side.
Sure. I'm originally from Rochester, New York, and that'll play into the Frederick Douglass answer a little bit later.
Good.
But I'm the fourth of 8 kids. My parents and an Irish family, of course. We had 8 kids, my parents, before they were 30 years old. So a lot of chaos growing up and a lot of great times growing up in Western New York. Although we're still waiting for the Buffalo Bills to win that Super Bowl for us. But left Rochester to go to college in Buffalo at Buffalo State, and then started graduate school up there. Loved Western New York and loved the people, but had an opportunity. A friend invited me to come down to stay with him while I looked at American University School of Law. I was thinking about that world for a little bit, but when I came down to visit, he said, "Hey, Pat, DC, it was 1989, the height of a crack epidemic in DC. He said, "Hey, Pat, come down, join the police department, live with me for a little bit, save some money, and if you want to go back to school, go back to school." So that's how it all started.
Wow. Well, there is one thing you left out, and that is your super cool middle name.
That's Aloysius, of
Aloysius,
course.
Yeah,
family, once again, the big Irish family has Cornelius, Aloysius, Seamus, all those middle names mixed in. But, very fortunate to have my parents are still with us and doing great. And I talk to my 7 brothers and sisters every week, and it's, I'm blessed to be part of a big family.
So my middle name is also super cool, and it is Kerwin.
Very nice.
Yep. Also an Irish surname. And but people don't talk about their middle names enough, so I'm glad we had a chance to. And these are the things one learns when they are reading Senate Judicial Committee nomination applications, right. Which I had the pleasure of reading yours in preparation for this interview. So speaking of that, talk to us about, this is top of my list, talk to us about your days at Mr. Goodbar.
Mr. Goodbar, was when I think about experiences and jobs that prepared me for life and prepared me for law enforcement, people say, was it graduate school, or what did you do that helped you in your career? And the number one thing I will always say is working as a bartender. Because when you work in public service or when you're in a service industry, you learn to talk to people. So number one is I'm a 185-pound guy and worked as a bouncer for a little bit, or door person. Rule number one is talk to people so you don't get punched in the face.
Right.
And a lot of times when you're bartending, you're dealing with folks that have personal problems, might be impaired, might be going through something, a bad divorce. But when you really can think back to how you can have a conversation with somebody, treat them with respect, listen, and truly empathically listen to them, I think it really goes a long way. And that all applies to law enforcement. The more you can empathize with people, and I think that's one of the greatest skills of a police officer, whether it's somebody got their bike stolen, might not be a big thing in the grand scheme of thing when you're responding to robberies and homicides, but it's a big thing to that person. If you can empathize with them and be the person that helps them, and that it might be that one time in their life they call the police. If you can make that a positive interaction, it goes a long way.
Yeah. You were a bouncer there, were also a bartender? Or no?
I was. I went from that world into bartending, and it was great to be out with my friends, but not spending money, making money.
Right, exactly.
It was a great experience, and paid my way through college and grad school.
Well, and in both of those roles, you have to hear people who are upset about things,
sure,
excited about things, disgruntled at you personally, or at least projecting that onto you. So I imagine that a lot of that is, transferable into the role of an officer. That I imagine they just do that on a daily basis.
It absolutely does. When I think about successful law enforcement officers, it doesn't take big muscles. It requires somebody that can listen and empathize with others and really work through their problems, or even someone who's agitated, maybe to talk to them a little bit more than resorting to force or some of the other alternatives officers have.
Yep. So I got to read through the Judiciary Committee application, and super impressive, all the things that you've done in your career, which is why I'm so excited to have you on here. And I wanted to lead off my questions with, do you have time to sleep, and how is that possible? Because
I do now.
You do? Good. Yeah, I can't imagine, reading through your bio and all that, you're committed to, and, raising, 4 kids, and, just how it's possible to continue rising in the ranks, and also then retiring and taking on, a lot of other positions. So how did you balance all that?
I think 2 of the most important decisions you make in your life are what career path you choose, what profession, and who you marry, who your partner is. And I was blessed in both. I've been married for 30 years to a wife who I met while I was in the police academy. So she saw the bad times of policing, working midnights, spending all day in court, missing kids' birthdays, and she's always been super supportive of me. And policing, the way I look at it is, and I continue to look at it, is it's a profession where you're actually paid to help people. When you think about that, isn't that a wonderful thing? You get paid to help people. Now you've got your tough days, and and the hours are really tough. I know, talking to the chief and a lot of our MPD officers every day, we're down about 600 cops in DC. There's a lot of officers that have days off canceled regularly. They're held over. But you know what? At the heart of the matter, they're out there helping people, and that's a blessing. So I've been very fortunate from that perspective.
What percentage does that 600 number represent?
Of the agency? Well, typically, and I know the Mayor Bowser, who's been very supportive of the Metropolitan Police Department, is trying to push us to about 4,000, where we've typically been. Right now we're lingering around 3,400. So a lot of work to be done. And there was one year where the MPD was defunded. And when you lose 1 year of recruiting, it sets us back about 6 years.
Oh, wow. Interesting. I'm sure not many people know that.
Yeah, that's tough. You can't just, might sound good on its face that we're going to defund police for 1 year. But when you think about, to give MPD as an example, if we hire roughly 300 a year on a good year, and we lose that for 1 year, and you think about your normal attrition rates, and we lose another 300, 400, it's tough. It takes years to make that up, especially, where there's, pretty significant hurdles to get through in the hiring process, with a polygraph and everything. We want the best and the brightest police officers. So, and we're competing with a region that's also hiring as well.
Right. So I wanted to keep going into your time at Metropolitan PD. Was there a rank that you did not hold?
I think I've been at every rank within the police department. So, that's been a blessing. I think one of the joys I always say, especially in a larger area, or a larger police department such as MPD, there's a lot of opportunities for promotion, movement to different groups. For instance, I did a lot of my career in Special Operations Division. I did a number of tours there and ultimately wound up as the Homeland Security Chief, where I oversaw Intel and Special Operations Division. So a lot of opportunities for officers for movement around the agency, and I was just eager to learn, and I consider my career, I'm kind of a Forrest Gump, where, you know, a kind of a simple, happy guy has great opportunities, and as I always say in DC, whether it's popes or presidents or the things that we have a front row seat to, I was blessed and serendipitous enough to be involved in so many of those occasions.
So you ended your career at MPD as assistant chief.
Yes.
Has there been opportunity for you to become chief, either in MPD or other departments?
As I always say, it's nicer sometimes to be a number two than to be a number one. I've worked for some great chiefs in MPD. I think we've been very fortunate to have some excellent leadership, including right now with Chief Conti. I've had conversations with people about becoming a chief in other areas, and it's really, at the end of the day, something I chose not to pursue. I was, once again, very fortunate to leave MPD to go right to work for the federal government for President Obama and his administration as the U.S. Marshal for Washington, D.C., and then had a great opportunity to get back to my roots, especially with supporting youth in D.C. and minority youth, working for the D.C. Police Foundation and teaching, which is a passion of mine as well. So it's somehow, it's funny how life works out.
Yeah.
You know, as I tell my kids all the time, work hard, pay your dues, and good things happen.
Right. And so your son's currently with MPD, is that right?
He is.
Yeah. How long has he been there?
Interestingly, he was a chemical engineering major at the University of South Carolina. And a few years back, I had the chief over for a dinner. And my son had an opportunity to talk to the chief. The chief was a former cadet, so he joined the department at age 18.
Wow.
My
Really?
son was, I think, intrigued. Obviously, he grew up around policing with me and in the back of a police car, as I had a take-home car for 24 of my 27 years.
Yeah.
But he came home at a break and said, "Hey, Dad, I'm interested in pursuing policing." And I said, I couldn't be more proud. There's no more noble profession on the face of the earth. And if that's in your heart, and you truly want to help people, then it's a great position to pursue.
Yeah. Do you think there's something inside of you, your son, other officers that make being able to do that possible? I mean, is there a trait that you think that links officers in some way?
I really think that it's the willingness or the desire to take care of people, to look out for folks that, you know, maybe as a child you see somebody that's bullied or a kid sitting alone at the lunch table where you feel a desire to help somebody that's alone or sad.
Yeah.
Everybody's had personal experiences in their life. You know, with a big family, I've had issues with alcoholism, depression, domestic violence in my family, even though I love my parents and my father. There were a lot of tough times growing up, and my mom was an anchor and a role model for me. But those, I think, helped guide me in my decisions and really even how I interacted with people in the police department, being exposed to some often harsh circumstances. But I think it guided me to want to help people.
Well, I think there's even more to that. I mean, to want to help people is one thing, and then to be able to do it and face fear at the same time, that I think is unique.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, though, I think, with officers. When I think about fear, and we kind of have a little running joke with some firefighters, and I know Chief Donnelly, who's the head of DC Fire, we've had this conversation before. Police will say firefighters are crazy for running into a fire, and firefighters will say the cops are crazy to running into a gunfight.
Right.
So it's just perspective. But it's interesting. As I always say, if there were a call that came out today for a man with a bazooka, officers would come out of the woodwork to respond to that man with a bazooka. A man with a gun, you don't think of it. It's your job. It's inherent.
Right.
The one interesting thing, when you do retire, it's the adrenaline rush. Almost, when something big happens, January 6th, or a significant event that involves the police department, Navy Yard or a significant event, that's when you kind of feel like, I wish I were still in the fight to help out everybody that's responding.
Right.
So but you don't think about the fear. Obviously, you're cautious and hopefully smart about your response and your tactics that you learned in the academy and on the street. But, fear is one of those things you just learn to live with, and hopefully your faith and other things will guide you through.
Yeah. So, and not to keep picking on your son, but when he decided that, he wanted to become an officer, were you surprised, or did you think like, oh yeah, I could see that? Like you're,
100% surprised.
Really?
Never any inclination of police work. Although I never had any desire. It was always law school.
Right.
And then things worked out. And as I said, it was a blessing in retrospect. But never any inclination, never mentioned as a child. But I couldn't be more proud of him to see him out there, to see him in uniform. He had a great gun arrest 2 days ago with possession with intent to distribute an extended magazine, and putting himself out there and working hard and trying to keep the citizens safe.
Good for him. So I read in 2002 you received a Lifesaving Award, and actually there was twice. What happened with that?
I did. Those were for my efforts in actually traffic safety. I was under Chief Ramsey and Chief Gaynor at the time. I'd set up a number of programs with MPD that they felt were so significant that they wanted to award me with a Lifesaving Medal. So, and I'm still very involved in the impaired driving effort. There's a group, the Washington Regional Alcohol Program, that you may have read in my resume, where I'm the chairman of their board right now. And we work to reduce impaired driving, underage drinking in the metropolitan area. Some of the programs that I came up with in the city, obviously we did a lot to get our seatbelt usage in DC above 90%, which is, of course, a life-saving effort, and also our initial efforts in photo enforcement. So that was back in 1999 when DC first started our photo red light program. In 2001, which seems like a long time ago now, for our first speed enforcement program in the city.
How do you measure that 90% of people are wearing their seatbelt?
Through surveys. District Department of Transportation does regular surveys through NHTSA and some other groups, but really not only for the public, but for law enforcement to wear their seatbelts.
Absolutely.
As you know, at the National Law Enforcement Memorial, with so many officers that have lost their lives from not wearing a seatbelt or something that's absolutely preventable, that's something that's a passion of mine.
Yeah. Well, and I hope we get to a point with law enforcement where it's just that second nature, like it is with civilians. I mean, thinking about a time where I was growing up still, where people just didn't wear seatbelts, is just crazy.
Absolutely. When you think about, especially for an officer, putting on your vest every single day, buckling your seatbelt, two simple things that can absolutely save your life. And the good thing, I think, when you think about the younger generations, all four of my kids wore seatbelts. It's second nature. The same way that I don't think they would think twice about getting into a car after they've had something to drink.
Right.
They've got public transportation, Uber, Lyft, you name it, and other options. So they plan ahead, I think, better than a lot of their seniors would do.
Right. So I wanted to go back into the application again. When you became the U.S. Marshal, how long did that whole process take? I'm really kind of fascinated by this process because, I encourage anybody to look up some of these applications because they're all just monsters. I mean, they are, I don't know how many total pages it was, but to be able to track down that much information, and I imagine, you get kind of enchanted with this idea, like, I could do that. And then, then reality hits and they're like, oh, please complete this application. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I want this job anymore, because it was just so big. So like, walk me through what that process was like, and, when did it start? When did it end? All the dirty details.
In total, it was probably over a year process. And actually some folks had reached out to me and said, hey, Patrick, would you consider applying for this position? There's been some interest that's been shown in you with your background and your connections. So I first started actually talking through with President Obama as president. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton has really a big role to play in choosing the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. So interestingly, my first steps were meeting with Congresswoman Norton and her staff. And then she actually held a panel of interviews with a number of the candidates, prospective candidates, a number of who were career marshals. And the great thing was, and a proud moment in my life, when I went into this table, in front of this table of community leaders, probably about 20 at this conference table, I knew everyone.
Wow.
So they were people I had interacted throughout my career with in MPD, and I had a great reputation and a working relationship with each one of these individuals from various communities and socioeconomic status, and it was a very proud moment to be in that position. And then interestingly, a latter interview after Congresswoman Norton pushed me through was to meet with the DOJ and another table panel interview. And it was interesting. There was kind of a revered attorney for the DOJ who's since passed away, but was known to ask some colorful questions about presidents and some history. So that I thought was a great experience. And when I thought about it in retrospect, that was the first time I'd had a job interview probably since I was 16 years old, and here I am, a 50-year-old guy. So I thought that was kind of funny, being in that position. But it was a great process. And the interesting thing about that nomination process was, prior to my nomination as U.S. Marshal, which once again is a presidential nomination and Senate confirmation, President Obama had nominated Merrick Garland, our current Attorney General, to be a U.S. Supreme Court Justice.
Right.
And now the Republicans in power at that time weren't too happy with that nomination. They wanted to wait till the next president had that. So the word on the street essentially was they're not going to push any other nominations through. Right. So I was very auspicious to have a Republican Senator, Dan Sullivan from Alaska, who was a friend and a former Marine, guide me through the process, introduce me to Senator Grassley and some of the senators. And I think I was one of very few presidential nominees that made it through the process, and I was confirmed unanimously. So that was it's nice to have friends on both sides of the aisle.
So, and that was as Obama was leaving office?
Yes.
Yeah. And then, so how long were you U.S. Marshal?
I stayed, I had the opportunity to stay for multiple terms.
Oh, okay.
But when President Trump came in, I had been asked by Chief Lanier, my boss at the MPD, our chief of police, had just taken a job as head of security for the NFL. So Chief Newsham came to me and said, "Hey, Pat, I really need you to run our police foundation." And I said, "Well, Chief, no, I can't. I burned some bridges to get through the process, and these senators helped me out, and I feel that I'm needed here." And when the administrations changed, it was nice to know that I had a position in the new administration. But Chief Newsham came back to me and said, "Pat, this is your passion." So Chief Newsham and Chief Lanier took me out to dinner and essentially said, "This is where we need you." And you know what? As much as I loved being the U.S. Marshal, and it's great to hold that title and to be a presidential nominee. My heart and my roots are really in policing. And I always said DC has done so much for me in my 27 years as a cop and 30 plus years that I need to give back to the city. And, the marshals continue with great leadership, and they've got wonderful people to step up in those positions. But when I thought about how I could be helpful in DC, my work really with minority youth and keeping DC kids out of the criminal justice system, I think that's what God put me in place to do. So I really do think there's divine intervention in guiding me into what's important in life. And I, just this past week, we've been out with the chief of police at Heroes and Helpers, Shop with the Cop, visiting DC public schools, Title I schools, making sure children have gifts for the holidays. That's a passion job. And to make a difference in a child's life, there's nothing more important.
Yeah. So I'm curious about the role the U.S. Marshal has. Tell me a little bit about what you did as the Marshal, what the office is like, what is your charge for the district?
Well, first of all, there's 94 U.S. Marshals. Some states have multiple marshals pending their sides, but that are presidential nominees. Very cool fact when you think about the U.S. Marshals Service. Oldest federal law enforcement agency, started in 1789. And George Washington personally selected the first 13 U.S. Marshals from the colonies. So when you think about cowboy movies and Clint Eastwood and the Marshal, you really think about a lot of things haven't changed too much. So if a judge comes to me and says, hey, Pat, this person's wanted for murder, and passes that warrant on to the U.S. Marshals, you put together, at the time might have been the bartender and your friends, you put together a posse and you go out and you get the bad guy. When you think about it today, it's, for instance, in D.C., it's the Capital Area Regional Fugitive Task Force. So it's a task force of the marshals and local PDs that are deputized to go anywhere in the country, and sometimes anywhere in the world, to track down the bad guys. So I think that's really at the heart of the Marshals' missions, but obviously they're protecting courthouses, protecting judges. Obviously, in today's environment, there are threats against judges. You've seen some acts of violence against judges or their families. So that's a very serious charge that they're tasked with, and a significant mission. But a lot of the work is taking care of prisoners, prisoner transportation. JPATs, they have their own prisoner transportation planes. And another thing I think that's really one of the areas where the marshals are best known, you'll hear witness protection. It's actually the Witness Security Program, or WITSEC, but protecting witnesses that might be high profile or in danger because of the testimony that they provide. So a multifaceted mission. They're doing a lot more with child sex exploitation, as many agencies, FBI, Secret Service, local police departments, MPDs, internet crimes against children. That's a real concern locally and nationally. So I'm glad to see the Marshals pick up that mission as well.
So as U.S. Marshal, you oversaw all of those operations for the District of Columbia.
For D.C., although there are separate entities that oversee the Fugitive Task Force operations.
So would you say then in that regard, you were chief, right? You were the leader over that division.
Sure.
So I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, Midnight Run.
I have.
Classic. Yep. Robert De Niro. I don't think people give that movie enough credit. But anyway, in that movie, he's a bounty hunter. Is that what you call him?
Could be. Yeah, bounty hunter. I forget. It's been a while since I've seen it, so I forget the exact role.
So there are people out there like Dog the Bounty Hunter.
Right.
So go after fugitives as well. What's the difference between what they do and the Marshals?
Well, the Marshals are doing it because they've been authorized legally by judges to pursue somebody. So once again, it might be anyone from a violent felon, a cartel leader, to somebody. A lot of times in D.C., if somebody's wanted for a homicide and they've left our jurisdiction, then they'll reach out to the Marshals or their fugitive task forces to initiate those operations for them, just because, once again, it's outside of their boundaries, and the Marshals can cover any of those territories as well.
So then what are the bounty hunters doing?
Bounty hunters, they're kind of doing it on their own, specifically for a bounty. So you can, if you're authorized to do so, you can try to track somebody down, through your own means, which certain people try to do. We prefer to let law enforcement handle those operations. Right. But it's, the one thing I think where the Marshals, obviously with technology and agencies pursuing criminals, do a good job. As I used to say, even the bad guys, the biggest criminals, the cartel leaders, they want to call their moms and their wives on their birthday. So there's typically a way to track people down. Right. You can stay off. Think about how tough it is to stay off the grid and not contact your family. You want to know what's going on or get an update. And when they do make those calls, that's typically, when they can be tracked.
Right. So since we're on this topic, this is indeed the thing you have in common, correct, with Frederick Douglass?
Yes. Actually, very few people know that Frederick Douglass was the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. And interestingly, just a couple things that we share, Frederick Douglass was a big leader in the suffragette movement. So he lived in Rochester, New York, my hometown, for 25 years, where he worked with Susan B. Anthony in the suffragette movement. And coincidentally, Frederick Douglass is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York, with Susan B. Anthony at the same cemetery. So little history. And then really when you think about, how amazing Frederick Douglass's life, so he far exceeds anything I would ever do. He once fled the U.S. Marshals because of the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1849, Frederick Douglass was considered a fugitive slave, and he later went on also to be the ambassador to Haiti. So the first African-American ever to be confirmed by the Senate for a presidential appointment. So Frederick Douglass, did a lot of reading about him as a child, and it's funny how our paths crossed in this way.
So when he was a fugitive headed to Haiti, were the Marshals looking for him?
In pursuit. Absolutely. The Marshals enforced the Fugitive Slave Act.
And then he became a U.S. Marshal.
And then he became the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. What an irony.
I know. That's incredible. So one of the reasons that you were selected by Obama and Obama administration to become the Marshal was because of your experience coordinating major events, such as the Papal Visit, G20 Summit, Nuclear Security Summit, and the 2009 Presidential Inauguration. What were some of the unique challenges that each of these brought? And I'm happy to go into any length of detail on each of these because I think they're all very different. They're all fascinating and probably require a different approach to some extent. So let's start with the Papal Visit because that's a little surprising to me that it requires the level of security that it does. So talk to us a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes to the extent that you can.
Well, it's obviously one of the most significant security events we have. It's classified by the United States Secret Service as a national special security event. So that's the highest tier of security. And any of those events, we had Pope Benedict in 2009 and Pope Francis in 2013 to Washington, D.C. So the Secret Service takes the lead in coordinating the security efforts of the myriad law enforcement fire agencies involved in this effort. And it's really one of the things that I'm most proud of in D.C., whether it's a Papal Visit or inauguration. It's really the cooperation and the relationships between Secret Service, FBI, MPD, Metro Transit, Capitol Police, Park Police, the partners that are involved in these efforts in this region. It's amazing how well coordinated these efforts are, how people work together. And I think we're very fortunate in DC to have the opportunity to work together on a daily basis. Because if it was just once a year or every 4 years, the relationships wouldn't be built. But everything that happens in D.C., every protest in front of the White House, every event that happens at the Capitol includes multiple agencies. So I think we're almost forced in a way to have these relationships. And one thing I've always stressed when I talk about meta leadership is the Military District of Washington. I think our major generals or commanding generals we've had in this region really do a good job of getting together the region's law enforcement and fire leaders. And I think it's important to build those relationships in advance of an event happening. So
did you say meta leadership?
Meta leadership, leading beyond your organization.
It's interesting. I had not heard that before. I want to come back to that, but I had a quick question. Is there, are there any other individual people besides the Pope that commands that level of security for a visit?
The single biggest one-day event in the history of Washington, D.C. was the 2009 inauguration of President Obama. And that absolutely required extensive time and effort into that detail. There would be nothing in my career And I think so many of the people that I worked with, nothing in their careers that will ever match that, the time and effort that we put in. And remember, with our first Black president, there were a significant amount of threats that came in where it really required a lot of time and effort from all of the intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies to make sure that it was a safe event. And I still remember vividly that day, a couple things from that day that really stood out, but just really the pride I had in knowing, even working with DC Fire and EMS, with the crowds, we were so concerned about crushing and something happened in positional asphyxiation because there were so many people packed into a tight area that if something happened, we would have people being crushed, essentially. So the work that we did to bring in a professor from Northwestern University, I still remember Dr. Mamasani, that came in, who's done work with events and crowd crushing around the world to reduce impacts and help us. A lot of great work that was done in that area. And the one thing that it's funny how things stand out in your mind. But I remember on the day of the inaugural, of course, I'm worried about security the whole way and monitoring everything every minute, and the crowds everywhere. Everybody was happy. It was a beautiful, cold day. But one of the incidents that stands out is I remember Dr. Ruth, who was an older doctor that talked about sex and everything. Some of the listeners my age would know Dr. Ruth more. I helped her with Secret Service to get into an area that she was trying to access. And I just remember her grabbing my cheeks and saying, "Patrick, I wish you good sex for the rest of your life." And I said, "Well, thank you, Dr. Ruth. I'm glad some people were around to hear that as well."
That's right. So crowd crushing is a field of study?
Absolutely.
Wow.
So when you think about significant events, the Hajj in the Middle East, right? Or pilgrimages that people, there have been significant deaths in those areas. So when you think about serpentining, rows of people, think about being in line for a roller coaster at Disney and just some of the efforts to mitigate the crowds. Yeah. One of the things that we put into place were using the National Guard at metro stations to meter the amount of traffic getting onto the platforms. If you have too many people, somebody could get pushed in front of a train.
Right, of course.
So there were really significant efforts taken to mitigate any potential for tragedy. And it was a fantastic event with considering, and the fire department really does extensive work on deployments to deal with potential heart attacks, and they've really got some significant formulas and work they do, and it was just a tremendous success for all the agencies, Secret Service, FBI, all of our partners that were involved in that day.
So, what it makes me think of is, and I don't know the adage or how the saying goes, but, when you look at the surface of a river, right, and you think it's, flowing at a certain rate, but really what's happening underneath is much more, turbulent. And I feel like that's the world that you all live in. And on the surface of what we experience when we go out to protest or when we attend an event or the inauguration or a parade or anything like that, we simply just walk up and enjoy ourselves and then go home.
Yep.
And so I don't think enough credit is given to the work that happens behind the scenes in that command center and the collaboration of all those agencies. So what's the first step? What's step one? So you're like, okay, well, the inauguration's coming. We need to ...
Plan, and coordinate, practice, and get ready. Even to the extent where you were thinking about red team drills, what can go wrong? If I were a bad guy and wanted to disrupt event, if I was a terrorist and wanted to disrupt event, what would I do? And really think about all the potential negative consequences as well. But I think it starts once again with relationships and knowing all the various partners from day one and working together with them on a regular basis, a lot of times socially as well, getting together and building those relationships before the event happens. Yep. And obviously you work better with people and that you trust. Yeah. And you've got to build trust with these people. And the nice thing I always said about this region, I know a lot of times in the media, they'll portray bad relationships between the Bureau and local cops. We've been so fortunate here to have great directors in the Secret Service, the FBI, Park Police, Capitol. All of our leaders have been fantastic that we've had a chance to work with. And at the end of the day, I always give the credit to the officers on the street. We can plan as much as we want, but it's the officers, the agents that are out there that are executing the plans.
So who calls the first meeting? I mean, who determines the jurisdiction? Who's leading? Is there a leader?
National Special Security events, always the Secret Service.
Okay.
So they've got, that's defined, and there's a presidential directive that dictates that, which is great. I think they do a great job. It's kind of like planning a giant birthday party,
right?
And giving everybody their assignments, who does what. Secret Service, well-versed in that area, professionals, and every leader from Secret Service has been great to work with. Proud organization.
Wow. I wanted to talk a little bit about the G20 and having, now you're on now that you're not with the Papal Visit, but now there's like 20 of them, and so how do you then coordinate internationally? I assume that some countries have more infrastructure kind of built in than others, and that type of leadership. What are some examples of that?
Well, once again, it's a group effort. These are, significant events when you've got a lot of world leaders. Just this past week in D.C., they had an African Leaders Summit.
That's right.
So a lot of the city was locked down where you had a number of leaders. So it's just basically coordinating multiple security details, and once again, good cooperation amongst the agencies. So I think that's really what it's all about. It seems a little bit more complex. There's a lot of planning that goes into it, but unless there's a specific threat against somebody, usually I think we do pretty well. Now, it's interesting, typically when we have somebody, let's say the president of China comes to town. Now, in China, you can't protest against the president of China. So now, we have to explain to their security teams and their details that in America, you have a First Amendment right to have reasonable access to that person to protest. So, whether it's guarding a hotel site or a route, it's not always an easy conversation, but the rules in America and First Amendment rights and other rights are far different than what you can do in China and Russia. So that can be a little complicated sometimes, and it seems like I'm having that same conversation year after year with some of their embassies and dealing with them. But ultimately, they understand, and a lot of times they would bring in their own counter-protesters to put a good face on things as well. So those were some of the interesting perspectives. But I think I've been fortunate in my almost 30 years or 3 decades of law enforcement in D.C. We've done a great job protecting diplomats and folks from around the world, and there's, that's important for our country.
I wanted to switch gears to another major event, but a bit more tragic than Papal Visits, and that is January 6th, 2021. And as with most major events, we learn more as time passes and reflect on what happened. And so to the extent, you're comfortable, can you tell us a little bit about your experience on that day, and then how, if at all, your perspective has changed over the last few years?
Sure. And just a backstory on that too. There was a conference in San Diego, an International Association of Chiefs of Police conference, where the Senate Sergeant at Arms reached out to me and said, "Hey, Patrick, would you be interested in being the U.S. Capitol Police Chief?" And I said, "No, I'm happy with my job as U.S. Marshal, but I know a guy." And that guy I recommended was Steve Sund. And Steve was a former Special Operations Division commander, a well-revered member of MPD. And when you think about those major events that we just talked about, Steve was instrumental in the success of all those events. I mean, a well-versed, smart, hardworking, dedicated individual. He's the first person I thought of when that came up, and ultimately Steve became the chief and was the chief on January 6th. And I know he's actually got a book being released on January 3rd, coincidentally upcoming, to talk about that. So I think as the facts come out about that day, one of the things I think you're hearing more and more is really about an intelligence failure. Was information relayed to the appropriate people so that they could appropriately plan? If we had DC National Guard there, would people have taken on the Capitol Police officers? As you can see, they were sparse. I do give a lot of credit to Chief Conti and Chief Newsham, who had just left to become the Chief of Police of Prince William County. But MPD, knowing that there could potentially be clashes between D.C. residents and Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, had neighboring jurisdictions ready or on standby to come in if we needed it. So that was great foresight by our chiefs. And at the end of the day, when the Capitol Police were overwhelmed and they called for MPD, I like to think that the DC Metropolitan Police Department went in and helped to save democracy. We had, I believe it was 85 officers injured from MPD, a number of Capitol Police officers injured. So a really tough day. Now, it's interesting from, a guy that used to run the command centers and be the incident commander. On this specific day, I was with my board chair, Mark Toohey from the Police Foundation, and had made my way down to the Joint Operations Command Center from MPD to drop off some things, but was there when essentially things broke bad. And I was extremely proud of our mayor, who was right there in the command center making decisions.
So you're just a block away. You're just right down the street.
Yeah, right down the street, right around the corner. Our chief of police making good decisions. His first week technically in office, although Chief Conti was a former Special Operations Division commander also, a smart guy and a well-versed guy. So both to see them both there making the decisions that they made that day were spot on, and I think went a long way to saving lives, securing the Capitol, and making sure that democracy continued. So as I said, when those things happen, you want to be in the fight somehow. And those were a lot of our officers, former SOD guys, that were in the mix, and some of the officers being hurt. And I've had a chance to talk to a lot of the MPD members that were in that situation, who've been through a lot of tough situations before. And as a number of our ERT, our emergency response team or SWAT team members, they described it as Viking warfare. If you could pick up somebody and hit them with it, that's what you did. It was fight for survival. And that's when you think about the push, the tug of war in the hallway, and Officer Hodges stuck in a doorway, and those really scenes that are tough for law enforcement to see. But a lot of heroes that day that stepped up in the law enforcement world, firefighters that were out there taking care of people as well. But a lot of heroic actions that day.
Yeah, and that just goes back to what I was saying earlier about something genetic in you guys. That when you see that happen and you run towards that is just exceptional.
Yeah. And I think there's a real interesting side to that as well. For officers that had to stay in the section to patrol the streets, it's almost a feeling of guilt that, hey, my brothers and sisters are down there fighting for this, and I'm out here doing something. Or if you were on day off, it's amazing how people New Jersey State Police self-dispatch to DC. So people want to be in the battle. When I think back to the Navy Yard attack in October of 2013, people self-dispatch. This is a man with a shotgun killing people, but you know what? People want to save lives.
Yep, right. It's incredible. Speaking of saving lives, there is a lot of ways to go about that, and I think the work that you're doing at the DC Police Foundation is helping connect a lot of young people with law enforcement, and so I want to talk a little bit about that. But before we get in specifically what you all are doing, talk a little bit about how the foundation itself came about.
Sure. Under one of our best mayors, in my opinion, Anthony Williams, who brought Chief Charles Ramsey, who was a mentor to me, into the city, the resources weren't what they ought to be for the police department, especially when it comes to things like youth services or how we're taking care of needs that are unmet. So the mayor and the chief set up a police fund working with our public and private partners, and that evolved ultimately into the evolution of the DC Police Foundation, where the goal is to meet the unmet public safety needs of the MPD with the help of our public and private partners. So we're very fortunate once again to have so many business partners, community members that are committed to making DC safe. And I think from Chief Ramsey to Chief Lanier to Chief Newsham to Chief Conti now, a big piece of their a priority commitment for them is really focusing on youth and specifically minority youth. What services can we provide to them? How do we build relationships between police and the community, especially minority communities? And how do we keep kids out of the criminal justice system? And that's really at the heart of policing, isn't it? It's not how many arrests we can make. Success in policing is the absence of crime. So how are we achieving that? And I think at the heart of that is, how are we helping our kids?
Yeah. Does I know other towns and cities, they have police foundations, or is it kind of a new concept?
No, I think some have been around for 20 plus years. Yeah. A lot of foundations might be smaller that might be just trying to get a canine vest for a dog or something like that, or vests for officers or things like that. I think, there's some disparity in what some of the groups do. Some of the larger ones might be focused more on technology or certain programs for the police department. Our focus has really been on police community relations here in the DC, which I think is paramount to the success of policing, not only here in DC, but around the world. And we've also been fortunate, for instance, with COVID. Chef Jose Andres and our community came together. Right. They probably did over $1 million in free meals for officers, and with the help of MPD, helped use those officers to help feed homeless and people in need. So it really builds those connections between police and the community. And I think, once again, when I think about one of the things I'm proud of with MPD, we're a minority-majority police department. I like to think we've got really strong relationships with the communities, Black, white, Latino, LGBTQ, different races, religions. I think we're a rainbow police department that represents the diversity of our city and does a good job to make sure everybody's treated with respect.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your approach at the foundation and what you all do in terms of the support that you provide young people, keeping them out of the criminal justice system? What's that program, and what do you all do with that?
There's a number of programs, but just to give you a few examples of our pipeline to once again keep kids on the right track. Just this past week, we were out with a number of our fifth graders at DC Title I schools throughout the city, and we have a program called the Junior Cadet Program. So these fifth graders have officers that come in to talk about civic responsibility and hopefully being mentors for these young people. And then what we'll do as a foundation is, a lot of kids don't have many opportunities to see things outside of DC, is we'll arrange field trips with their teachers and our police officers. Next month, we'll be going to the Udvar Hazy Air and Space Museum in Virginia. We'll go to Luray Taverns for an experience, as a lot of kids sadly don't even leave the city. We'll do Cox Farms for pumpkin picking, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the battlefields for leadership training. And typically every year we take a group up to New York City to the Statue of Liberty as well for a day trip to see, the great things and a little bit of the history of our country. So it's just a chance for these young people to interact with officers, interact with their teachers out of class, and once again to build relationships. And ultimately the goal is, number one, not only to have these kids, being civically conscious about being a good citizen of the United States, but maybe they'll think about a career in public service someday. And at the end, hopefully staying out of the criminal justice system and just being a productive member of society. Yeah.
One of the programs that you and I had talked about previously is the Citizen Engagement Academy.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about that experience, and who are some of the people that sign up for that?
And this can be community members from around the District of Columbia that just have an interest in policing, not always friendly toward the police. And I think just as you at the National Law Enforcement Memorial, show some people kind of the shoot and don't shoot scenarios. Right. That's what we try to do. Why? I think a lot of the public is curious. You see something on TV, but a citizen might ask, why didn't the officer just shoot that person in the knee? Or why didn't they shoot out the tire rather than taking whatever tactic that they engaged in? And this is our chance to really show why law enforcement does what they do, why they take action in certain ways, why they talk in certain ways and give directives in certain ways. And I think, even in folks that come in with an adversarial position toward law enforcement come out of it with a greater understanding. They might not agree with everything and policy, but I think they have a greater understanding of why law enforcement does what they do. And they've got a great chance to go through the training academy, conduct traffic stops that are simulated on their own, talk with law enforcement leaders and the people that are actually out there doing the job. So for anybody that is interested, it's a great opportunity to interact with the police and you'll have a new understanding and I think an appreciation of law enforcement.
How many people participate?
They'll do multiple cohorts per year. I think they do about 25 per cohort. I know I spoke to the last group, and we're working on an abbreviated business engagement academy that we hope to start again. A lot of our corporate leaders might not have as much time, but we'll work on getting them engaged more also.
That's a good idea. How much time does it involve?
Usually it's one day a month. Typically, well, you'll go out for a few hours, and then we encourage people as well to do a ride along with a DC police officer to see what and hear from an officer on the streets as well. So that's just a great opportunity to talk to somebody and potentially a good recruiting opportunity for us as well.
Right. I'm curious, is there a liability there? I mean, do you all have to have specific insurance, like when you take people out and ride along, or
typically they'll sign a waiver, but we're not, if there's that man with a gun call that we talked about before, that officer is not responding to that call. Right. We're not going to put anybody in danger. Obviously, we treat everybody in those situations like it was our own mother or a family member.
Right. So they're not in a hot pursuit.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. We're going to keep those folks safe. But it's great to see, first of all, a talk with an officer, build a relationship, but just kind of see what a day on patrol is like. It's funny because I remember taking so many people out while it's an experience they remember for a lifetime. I'll talk to folks I took out 30 years ago and they'll still remember something that I forgot long ago.
Yeah. So our executive director for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial met his wife on a ride along. She came on a ride along. That's how they met.
Hey,
you never know.
It's a new way to date.
That's right.
Ridealong.com.
Yeah. That could be. That could be a way of marketing the program.
That could be.
Yeah. And so you all support young people, adults interested in learning more about law enforcement. How does the foundation support officers within MPD? Are there programs for that?
Well, first of all, through recognition of our officers, through awards. We have a ticket booth for officers. So if a lot of our corporate partners, especially if they have tickets, we're very blessed in this city to have so many professional sports teams, and the sports teams are usually good about providing tickets as well.
Oh, good.
That, let's say if the chief has somebody that just received a Lifesaving Award this week, maybe we can send them to a Caps game or a Wizards game this time of year.
Yeah.
Send them to a show or a concert. So there's been so many opportunities to do great things, to recognize officers that have done great work on the street, and it's an opportunity for us to give back to them.
Right. That's good. I wanted to switch topics to teaching.
Sure.
So I think that's something that's really interesting in terms of the direction you've gone after your career as an officer and then as a marshal. So what is it that you love about teaching that's different than what you received as an officer? When
I think back to what, as I said, the MPD's given a lot to me. Chief Ramsey sent me to grad school at Johns Hopkins as a young lieutenant. And then I had the opportunity to receive a master's degree from Naval postgraduate that was paid for as well. And I'll never forget that. That was a wonderful experience for me and contributed to my development as a leader in MPD and beyond. But I really think that anyone in law enforcement at any level has learned so much. We all have an obligation in some way to pass it on. So I was fortunate in 2013 to start at George Washington University and taught there for a number of years. Wasn't able to teach as a U.S. Marshal. You can't have any outside employment. But when I came back, came to the foundation, I started at Georgetown University in 2018, and it's just a chance to give back to young people. Now it's graduate level work at Georgetown. They have a master's degree in applied intelligence. Every student in there is a lot smarter than I am. They're type A, but you know what? They're the future leaders of America and in law enforcement. So it's great to see them. Some of them already in law enforcement positions, state, local, federal level, some pursuing positions. But it's just good to see and contribute, bringing guest speakers to broaden their horizons, hear from a practitioner of my experiences in the intelligence world, and hopefully build future leaders.
How did the opportunity come up in GW? Where did it begin?
There was, interestingly, a good friend of mine. As I said, life's about relationships. There was another assistant chief, a guy named Jeff Dolinsky at Metro Transit, who was involved in their program. And Jeff's a good friend, reached out to me and said, "Hey, Pat, we need some good people." And I came over and worked with him. Great experience.
Is that a Homeland Security related program?
I was Homeland Security, a lot of work in emergency management.
Yeah.
Another friend from the FBI came on shortly after me. So it was a great group of people. And I also look at it as an opportunity to expose people to different positions. There's a sergeant at MPD right now who was an officer at GW Police who was in the program and came on to MPD, and he's doing a great job. So it's an opportunity to expose people to some different opportunities. And once again, a great chance to broaden a young person's, sometimes not always so young, because I've had students that are older than me in the class too, but just to give them some different experiences or learn about different aspects of the intelligence world.
How do you teach applied intelligence?
Applied intelligence, really, a lot of it is based upon their backgrounds as well, getting through the intelligence cycle, the roles of different intelligence agencies, the types of technologies that are used, really compliance with the United States Constitution and the importance of ethics in this world, as there's a lot of gray area in intelligence, especially with the proliferation of technology. You think about burgeoning facial recognition and some of the things that are on the horizon. How quickly do we go, and making sure there's policies in place to make sure that we're protecting people's rights?
Yeah. When you started your career, did you think it was going to also include all these other experiences, assistant chief to, board chairman, nonprofit leader, U.S. Marshal, professor at multiple universities, and I believe coming up, you're going to be leading the transition for the public safety division for the DC Attorney General. Is that correct?
I'm one of the co-chairs for, we have a new Attorney General, Brian Schwab, coming in very soon. So we're working with his committee to provide some guidelines and some efforts there, which I'm looking forward to and happy to be working with a great group of people committed to improving DC as well. But when I think about it, and really what I've wanted out of life, it's and especially in my early days as a cop, it really wasn't to get promoted at all. It was just to make a difference and to help people. And I think when I was promoted a lot of times was I just felt I could do that better, or I can help officers better. And as I'll say to any official right now, your job is really to take care of your officers. Obviously, if something bad happens, you've got to deal with that. But these are men and women that are professionals out there, putting their lives on the line to take care of people. Get to know them. when you think about all these names on our law enforcement memorial, and the wonderful stories, get to know the people behind those stories. A lot of people are struggling out there too, officers. We need to do a good job taking care of them, whether, somebody might be going through a divorce, they might have a child with a disability, when they're working tremendous hours and under tremendous stress. They really need the support of their supervisors in all aspects. So I think that's really pushed me to get promoted in a lot of ways. And there was another official I worked with that kept a little motto on his desk that always said, remember where you came from. And whether you're the chief or any position in an organization, you have to remember it's the officers doing the work. So I my full gratitude to all the officers and the smart people I worked with that helped me get to where, as I said, I consider myself a Forrest Gump kind of guy who's been hardworking, but just through serendipity found myself with all of these opportunities to do good things for people. And as I said, I really think it's been my passion for helping people that's given me all these opportunities and really keeping that in my heart. But when I was especially a young husband and dad, I always said, and I still say, my number one goal in life was just to be a good husband and be a good father. And 30 plus years on of marriage now, I'm blessed to have a great wife who's supported me along the way, and we've had a lot of fun doing it, and 4 fantastic kids. That's really, when I think about my legacy, it's my family, to have these wonderful people that have stuck through me through my hard times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So were you able to manage excelling at work at a certain level in a very stressful career, raising kids, being a great husband, all that? Do you have any particular routines or sports, athletics, like what keeps you healthy and keeps your energy level where it needs to be in order to stay focused like that?
That's a great question. And I think this is really important for all of law enforcement, because so many officers, when they retire, are dying at young ages because they're not taking care of themselves. So I've always been committed to fitness. I've run 6 marathons. I was just telling somebody earlier today, when I think about my toughest times in police work, if I could go out and run 15 miles, that was, as my friend said, it was cheaper than therapy.
Totally.
But it absolutely secreting endorphins and staying in shape was key. Having, regardless of your religion, having a base, a moral base, a North Star to guide you through is critical, regardless of religion or faith. But having those key things, and then relationships. I think a lot of officers, when I think about difficult relationships, the stress, potential alcohol, and other factors that come in, just avoiding those things. And there was an author who was very popular, wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think I was first turned on to Stephen Covey in grad school at Johns Hopkins. But one of the sayings that Covey had, and I mentioned this to the chief of police last week, is he said, talking about all of his work with the top business leaders in the country, he said, you work so hard to climb the ladder of success, you get to the top of the ladder and you realize it was against the wrong wall. So you work so hard, but you realize, I'm divorced now. I don't know my kids. So I always tell young people and young officers, I've coached all 4 of my kids in sports. Sometimes it's been sporadic, and I've been fortunate to have been blessed with a wonderful wife, but be involved in your kids' lives in any way you can. Get home to read them a story at nighttime. Anything you can do to be a part of their lives, that helps to make up for those days off canceled and the birthday that you missed and the tough things. But, if you can get through that, when you climb to that ladder, whatever level it is, you know what, you're going to have a family to enjoy those next years with.
Yeah. I just ran the Marine Corps Marathon in October.
6 times, my favorite.
If you want to do it in 2023, I'm down. I'll run it with you.
I appreciate that.
I run very slowly, We could take it easy.
I did a 3:30 marathon. 8-minute miles was my highlight. Although there was a chief of police for U.S. Park, Rob McLean, who of course had to beat me and was faster. But
well, that's incredibly fast.
That's an 8-minute mile for 26, so that's not too bad.
That's impressive.
But unfortunately for me, I had a hip replacement in March. Okay. So I'm my new favorite sport though, pickleball.
Well,
I am all
along
in
with
pickleball.
Everybody else's.
Yeah. But I tell you, I'm in great shape. I feel like I'm in the best shape of my life playing pickleball and lifting weights. Absolutely.
That's awesome. Before we close out, I wanted to just hear if there was any reflections on your work, your past experiences that you would do differently in some way.
There's always little things that you pick apart, but really, I can't say there's anything I would change. I've been blessed to be in this profession and to continue to give back in the way that I can. When I think about I think a question you had talked about earlier were quotes that you live by. I'm a huge quote guy, and there's a million of them for me.
Yeah.
But when I talk to my son and young people, I think about, back to Aristotle, who said, "We are what we habitually do. Therefore, excellence is not an act, but a habit." So if whatever you do in life, whether it's exercise, being a good cop, listening to people, trying to be a good husband, you might go out there and save somebody's life one day, and then, the rest of the year you're nothing. It's habitually what you do every single day that you get up, take care of yourself mentally, physically, your family, and you commit to that and you make it a habit, then you're going to do great things in life.
Yeah. Well, excellent. I think that's a perfect place to close. And it's a perfect place to be at in your career and your life. So, congratulations, and, thank you for all that you've done for Washington, D.C. and the people who live in it.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And to all of our law enforcement officers out there, stay safe. God bless you. And thanks for all the great work you do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Icons featuring Patrick Burke and hosted by Thomas Canavan, the museum's executive director. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.